Hello, my name is Colton Cooper, and I'm introducing the Lincoln-Douglas debate topic of whether or not American citizens and healthcare workers should be sent into West Africa to help fight Ebola. And I am representing the affirmative side. It is because I agree with Peter Weber, a senior editor at TheWeek.com, in the position that the United States has a moral obligation to help fight Ebola, that I feel compelled to affirm today's resolution resolved. That American healthcare workers should be sent into West Africa to help fight the battle with Ebola. For clarification of today's round, I offer the following definition. Moral obligation. Source, thefreedictionary.com. Definition, an obligation arising out of considerations of right and wrong. The highest value within today's round is whether or not more lives can be saved by sending medical professionals to West Africa. This value is most important in today's round because the fight against Ebola is intended to save lives. The best criterion for evaluating this solution is in order to save lives. This criterion is defined as the amount of saved lives. It best achieves my value of whether or not more lives can be saved by sending medical professionals to West Africa because it retains to saving lives. In affirming this resolution, I offer the following contentions. Contention 1. If the United States does not act by sending health professionals to West Africa to help battle Ebola, it will jeopardize the health of not only people in the currently infected regions, but it will also jeopardize the health of people in other nations and or even the United States. Quoting Thomas Jefferson here, "The care of human life and happiness, and not their destruction, is the first and only legitimate object of a good government." Once again, Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States. What he is saying here is that the United States has an obligation to help protect people of other nations in order to save their lives and protect their, health and well-being. Quoting Anthony Bonbury, United Nations Special Representative and head of the United Nations Mission for Ebola Emergency Response, or UNMIR here, "A failure to act now that we have the chance could lead to an unpredictable but very dire consequence, not only for the three countries most affected, but for the rest of the world. No country is safe." So what he is meaning by this is that Ebola is spreading at a very quick rate, and that countries do need to step up and help the people in these countries in order to keep it from spreading further, in order to even help the other countries from having a pandemic throughout the world. Moving to contention 3 now. If no action is taken against the Ebola epidemic, an estimated 1.4 million people will become infected with Ebola. Quoting the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention here. "Without additional interventions or changes in community behavior, CDC estimates that by January 20th, 2015, there will be a total of approximately 550,000 Ebola cases in Liberia and Sierra Leone, or 1.4 million if corrections for underreporting are made." These quotes are estimates, I should say, are just for Liberia and Sierra Leone alone. Those do not account for other nations. If conditions remain unchanged, the situation will rapidly become much worse, which is another quote directly from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So the United States does need to step up in order to prevent it from spreading even further. Contention 3 now is that if the medical personnel take the proper precautions, they can avoid contracting and transmitting this disease. Quoting WHO, or the World Health Organization here, "Healthcare workers caring for patients with suspected or confirmed Ebola virus should apply extra infection control measures to prevent contact with patients' blood and body fluids. Contaminated surfaces or materials such as clothing and bedding, when in close contact, such as within 1 meter of patients with Ebola virus. Healthcare workers should wear face protection such as a face shield or a medical mask and goggles, a clean non-sterile long-sleeve gown and gloves, and sterile gloves will be needed for some procedures, of course. Once again, this quote was from the World Health Organization. And now I would like to open the stage for my opponent on the negative side of this debate.
I would like to start my questioning by asking you how relevant you think Thomas Jefferson is to this debate, considering his presidency and his life was approximately 200 years ago, and they didn't have or were exposed to Ebola or facing those problems involving this disease like we are today.
Okay, I see your concern here. Well, Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States, and I believe that his advice should concern today and in pretty much all situations. He says, "The care of human life and happiness, and not their destruction, is the first and only legitimate object of good government." So what he's saying here is that any good government would step up in any situation to protect other humans.
Okay. What was the number that you said for the predicted deaths from the CDC in the countries by 2015?
Well, estimated, if not accounting for underreporting, is 550,000 people, and that's just in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And if they do account for underreporting, then they're estimating 1.4 million infected people.
Do those numbers include the possible efforts the United States are taking to help these Ebola victims?
These estimates are if conditions remain unchanged. So, with the help that the United States is giving right now, yes.
Are you aware that the protocol being followed to prevent the Ebola being spread with the various attires and clothing being worn are actually not being that beneficial, considering that the Dallas healthcare workers were actually exposed to Ebola and they took the necessary precautions?
Well, these healthcare workers were not properly trained. They were wearing protective suits such as a hazmat suit, gloves, and goggles. However, when they took it off, they actually touched the suit while taking it off, as silly of a mistake as that sounds. So they were exposed to the virus.
So you are saying that the United States isn't ready to handle Ebola victims?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that some hospitals are not equipped as well as others are.
Are you aware that there are only 10 beds in hospitals in the United States that are actually equipped to take care of Ebola victims?
And currently, however, the United States is screening people who have been to West Africa and who may have been exposed to Ebola, and if they do show symptoms or if they have been in contact with people with Ebola, they are being monitored for 21 days.
How effective would you describe these means of questioning and examining these patients coming from West African nations for Ebola?
Well, I believe that these are very effective as long as these people remain...
Even though there are only two methods to test them, the questionnaire and the temperature checking?
Yes, as long as they answer the questions honestly, they will be monitored, because if they have had contact with people with Ebola, or if they've been to a village where Ebola has been reported, they will be held and monitored.
If you were an Ebola victim trying to get back to the United States, would you be honest on a questionnaire knowing that it might not get you into the country?
Well, I know that the United States would help to treat me if I had Ebola, so yes, I would.
That was my final question. I would like to open my negative case for my standpoint in the Ebola topic. I would like to start by introducing a quote from the World Health Organization. "Good public health practices are still the basic weapons against a disease for which there is no cure. However, the traditional approaches will fail against Ebola. If that happens, vaccines and therapeutics are the only thing that can stop it. It is because I agree with the World Health Organization, a government agency, in the position that healthcare workers as well as United States citizens should not be sent over to West Africa until appropriate means or proper vaccines are developed, because traditional efforts against Ebola are not enough. That I feel compelled to negate today's resolution, resolved that prohibiting the transportation of U.S. citizens and healthcare workers to West Africa is necessary in limiting the transmission of Ebola. For clarification of today's round, I would like to offer a few definitions. The first one being infectious, from Merriam-Webster. It is a disease or a disease-causing organism that is likely to be transmitted to the people. Infectious is a word that describes Ebola. I would also like to offer the word endemic, also from Merriam-Webster. Its definition is belonging or native to a particular people, country, region, and I would also like to point out that Ebola is not endemic at the current moment in time. It is native to West Africa, but it is pandemic in that it is spreading to other nations very quickly. The highest value in today's round is the United States' duties of its government. The value, which is duties of the government, is defined as values arising out of social contract or the duty of the government to protect its citizens. The duties of the government are important in today's round because the government has duties to dictate the personal priorities of our nation's leaders and do what is best for the welfare, liberty, and lives of people within the United States. The best criterion for evaluating the resolution is teleology. This criterion, or teleology, is defined as a theory that the ends justify the means, but the means themselves may not be morally justifiable. This achieves my value of the duties of the government because it relates to the choices that the government makes on behalf of ourselves. Sometimes they may not be in the best interest that we see, but ultimately the government is looking out to protecting our nation and its people. For instance, if the U.S. stops contact with West Africa and the possible Ebola victims, the government can limit America's exposure to the disease. Some people might think this is being horrendous or a horrendous act because ultimately lives might die in the process of limiting the contact. But if we were to focus on, for instance, manufacturing a vaccine, then we could put our energy and time into that so that when we go back over to the West African nations to fight Ebola, we will be more prepared. In negating this resolution, I would like to offer the following contentions. Contention 1 being, if the government limits contact with West Africa and Ebola victims, the U.S. will have a decreased exposure to the disease. I would like to offer a warrant for this claim. Several African nations have restricted or banned air travel from Ebola-stricken countries, and airlines including Kenya Airways, British Airways, Coast Airways, and various airways in Nigeria, they have suspended flights from countries to lessen the distribution of the disease to the airport's home countries. This quote is from the Washington Post. Further explaining this, I have an impact. This impacts my claim by showing that the power that is held within the government to end is in the best interest of the people, the choices it makes. By limiting air trafficking in contact with Ebola-ridden countries, we can prevent the outbreak from spreading here to America. As we have seen, it has already spread, but we can prevent further spreading of the disease to more states within our nation. Contention 2 is that if the United States and other advanced countries work more diligently and put more time and effort into developing and manufacturing vaccines at a higher rate, more lives can be saved overall than just waiting for our means that we have currently over in Ebola-ridden countries to be effective. My warrant for this claim is that the effort to produce a vaccine or a more effective treatment than we have has become a race against a virus that has increased from killing 50% of its victims to 70%. The World Health Organization warned a few Tuesdays ago that Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone could see as many as 10,000 new Ebola victims per week by the year's end. If one or more works or ideas can be produced in adequate quantities, the course of this epidemic of Ebola might be altered and hundreds of thousands of lives could be saved. It could also prevent future outbreaks, and the story and history of this epidemic could be rewritten and forever be out of the history books for causing more damage. The impact of this shows that if the government stresses the importance of developing and manufacturing mass quantities of a working vaccine, that the Ebola epidemic in West Africa could be drastically altered from here into future generations. Yes, some lives will be lost in the time that we take to focus on manufacturing this vaccine, but ultimately more lives will be saved because we can prevent it from future cases. And this is from National Geographic. Contention 3 is that if the United States government informs its citizens of Ebola and its entirety of it, then the citizens will have a knowledge of the disease, and they will realize the severity of the situation the world has been put in, not only in foreign countries, but on home doors as well. My warrant for this information is that an informed and engaged public is critical to just about any nation's public health effort. The announcement of the first U.S. Ebola case many weeks ago emphasized the importance of the public being aware of what it is facing and what the others around them and the government can do to help the risk for Ebola. Everyone contributes to a global health security, and they must be informed and responsible in this role. If all the public is informed of what they need to do and the precautions they need to take, then overall we can have more protection and be safer against the fight against Ebola. And this is from the Congress blog The Hill. The impact of this is that if the government informs the people about Ebola and upholds its duty to protect its citizens, preserving its social contract, the citizens can learn, grow, and reduce paranoia. An informed public realizes the danger, the duties of the government, and should be willing to accept, trust, and honor the wishes of it. The government's choices are in the best interest of the welfare, life, liberty, and happiness that every American individual is entitled to. And in order to preserve this, we must keep our people from going over to West African nations so that we can preserve our happiness, work for a cure, and then help get their happiness back over in these West African nations. I would like to open the floor up to questioning.
All right, well, you state that the United States needs to focus more on developing a vaccine and a cure for Ebola.
Yes.
Is this correct? Yes.
That is what my claim is, yes.
Oh, all right, then. Do you not agree that the United States could focus on both sending... The United States is a large nation.
I believe that if we focus on both, then our minds will be more obliged and more concerned with the things of one more than the other. For instance, if we're sending people over into these West African nations like we have in the past, we will be more concerned with the fact that they could be infected themselves, and the families of them will be concerned of their family members over in these countries. We will also be concerned that if they come back into this nation, what if we are exposed to it? They could carry the disease on something of theirs, or more importantly, they could be carried themselves and be contaminated with this disease. They could bring it back, and then many people that they could be in contact with would have to be quarantined for 21 days. And that's really something that's unfortunate. And if we're worried about this, then we can't put our time and energy into manufacturing this disease that could prevent future outbreaks.
Okay, might I remind you, too, that currently the United States has not deployed anyone to go into the countries with Ebola, but instead it's on a volunteer basis. And that the United States, as long as they're being honest, there is an effective way of determining if, because they are being rerouted through 4 primary airports in the United States, and being interviewed, so there will be a red flag that will come up if they may have been exposed to Ebola or potentially have the virus.
Well, I believe if these volunteers are going to go over there and risk their lives, the government should inform them completely of what the potential that they have to harm their nation and harm themselves. They're putting themselves in harm's way, and I do not believe that the government has fully informed the public of the severity of the nations. Yes, there are websites and there are magazines and things that the people can go to, but that does not mean we understand it. If the government informs us, then I believe that the volunteers will be less likely to go over there and help because of the damage and detrimental effects that it can have on themselves and the people around them.
All right, so you believe that the American public is misinformed or not informed as thoroughly as they should be?
I believe that they are informed, but not as informed as they should be, yes.
Okay, so can you name 3 points of which you believe that the public needs to be more informed of with Ebola?
I believe that the public does not effectively know how to sanitize or prevent themselves from getting Ebola. I also believe they do not know how Ebola is actually transmitted. There's a lot of misconceptions about this. And I believe that they should know how long it takes to survive, the survival rates. I believe people, they assume that if you're in America, it will be easier to fight this disease. Just because we're in America does not mean we're equipped. Like I said, there are 10 hospital beds in America, and only 10 that can effectively treat Ebola.
All right, that was my last question. I'm turning the stage back.
To rebuttal. Time for your rebuttal.
Okay, well, I do believe that the public is not informed as they should be, and I believe that the public should be more aware and that they should not worry as much as they are worrying, because Ebola is a very difficult disease to contract, and it is also not as contagious as many diseases, such as I've seen one number before that said that Ebola is 1/100th as contagious as the flu. Also, going back to my quote from Thomas Jefferson in Contention 1, the care of human life and happiness, and not their destruction, is the first and only legitimate object of a good government. My opponent may say that the United States government should restrict travel to these nations, and that if these people were more informed, that they would not want to risk their lives and go over there. But I disagree. I believe that there are still some people who do want to help these people, even if it means risking their lives. And as Thomas Jefferson said, it is the only legitimate object of a good government, and that any good government would fully support going and helping these people. Also, going back to Contention 2, saying that if no action is taken, the Ebola epidemic could potentially affect 1.4 million people, and that's just in Sierra Leone and Liberia alone. So that is an outstanding amount of people, and with the current 80% death rate, that is a lot of people that could die, and the United States can focus on both, because the United States, in both developing a cure and a vaccine, as well as aiding these nations, because the United States is a very large and prosperous nation, and we can't afford to send some medical personnel over there and nurse these people back to health while a cure is being developed. Also, once again, returning to Contention 3, saying that the medical personnel need to take proper precautions. The United States should, for these people who are going to be caring for Ebola victims in the United States, and for the Ebola victims outside of the United States needs to offer some form of training for these people on, for example, on how to properly wear their hazmat suits, such as zipping up in the back, and how to remove the hazmat suits, so that they do not contract this virus themselves. As I said before, the United States is taking proper precautions on making sure that there's not a widespread outbreak in the United States, because they are rerouting these people who may have been exposed to Ebola, or, of course, potentially have contracted Ebola, through 4 primary airports within the United States. And at these airports, as soon as these people are off the plane, they are screened for Ebola by medical personnel, specifically doctors, who will interview them, asking them questions, taking their temperature, and if there are any red flags that come up, they will be monitored for 21 days for Ebola. And so far, these precautions have been very effective. And with that, I'm going to return it to my opponent.
For my rebuttal, I would like to start by saying that my opponent used a comparison between the flu and Ebola. What he fails to mention is that Ebola is more devastating to the health than just the flu. Yes, Ebola is harder to contract because of its natures that it can be contracted in, and the flu is more contagious in that way. However, Ebola is much more severe than the flu, as the flu can pass in a matter of days, but Ebola takes weeks to months to recover from. And flu has a slimmer chance of resulting in death, whereas Ebola has a 70% mortality rate. I would also like to point out that my opponent says that according to Jefferson, that it is the duty of the government to protect its citizens. Yes, it's the duty of the government to protect its citizens, but the duty of the government is also to protect the nation in itself. We are to protect its economy and many other attributes of the nation. We care about the U.S. citizens, yes we do, but we need to be concerned about everything within the nation, not just the people. I would also like to point out that my opponent likes to mention the fact that if we take the necessary precautions, then we can avoid Ebola. We have these hazmat suits and various other clothing and apparel. But what he fails to mention is that in the case of the Dallas healthcare workers, they took these precautions. They were nurses that had been trained for years, not in Ebola, but they had gone through training for Ebola. They had been nurses for years, and they took these necessary precautions, yet they still contracted the disease. The disease is spread through bodily fluids that can include sweat, urine, and other things. And these doctors and nurses, they contracted it, and now they're fighting for their lives too. I would like to point out that the Ebola outbreak that originally was in West Africa has been transmitted to several other countries. These include, but are not limited to, Guinea, Senegal, Nigeria, Liberia, Sierra Leone, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Spain, Australia, and most recently, the United States. The mortality rate has risen from 50% to 70%, and the survival rate is approximately 30% at this current moment in time. The disease is ravaging African nations where it has been cited. We must find effective means of halting this progression and cure this disease overall. If we prevent further outbreaks, then we can prevent more people from being affected by this disease. I would like to say that if we take these things into consideration, then we can help more lives by finding a cure for Ebola or finding ways to treat it more than just the ways that we have been taken right now. Our volunteers that are being over there and doing their work and taking their time to fight this disease, all their efforts are, I'm not saying they're in vain, but they're not being effective. As we have seen, the death toll has risen from 50% to 70%, and that's since that we've been over there helping. I hope I have shown you that if the government limits contact with West Africa and Ebola victims, then the U.S. will have a decreased exposure to the disease. If we limit these air trafficking and if we limit these contacts by various ways, means of flying or shipping, if we prevent our contact with these West African nations or these other nations that are exposed to Ebola, we can ultimately prevent it from further ravaging the nations that surround West Africa and ultimately affecting more lives within the United States. Also, if the United States and other advanced countries, if we work more diligently to procure a faster development and manufacturing rate of the vaccines, more lives can be saved overall. I would like to go back to my criterion, which was teleology. It means the ends aren't always justified by the means, but the ends themselves are justifiable. If we've put our time and energy into manufacturing this vaccine, think of how many lives will be saved in the end. There will be more lives to be saved, and we can halt future outbreaks from happening. Some lives will be lost in the time that we spent to find this vaccine and manufacture it at a higher rate, but ultimately we can stop this outbreak from happening again and ravaging more families and more lives like it has in the past couple months. I would also like to say that I hope I have shown that if the government of the United States informs its citizens of Ebola in its entirety which I believe it hasn't, then it will provide the citizens with a knowledge of the disease and help them realize the severity of the situation that the United States and the other world countries have been put in. We're facing various implications, and this can cause paranoia or mass hysteria, but hopefully if we alert the population to preventative matters that need to be taken, we can all live in peace and hopefully find a way to ultimately stop the spread of Ebola. For these reasons, we can clearly conclude that the duties of the government should be upheld in protecting the United States citizens. If we prohibit the transportation of U.S. citizens and healthcare workers to West African nations, then we can limit the transmission of Ebola. For these reasons, I must clearly say that we have to negate the resolution. I would like to pass back to my opponent for his final rebuttal.
Okay, so I'm presuming that everyone viewing this is a citizen of the United States, and I'm also presuming that you do not know how this disease started or prior to this, you do not extensively know how exactly that this disease spreads or how easily it spreads. So I'm going to point out here that Ebola it isn't a disease that's caused by food poisoning or the like. It's a disease that is originally found in fruit bats, and it does not have a negative effect on these fruit bats. However, in West Africa, these West African villagers are encroaching on the fruit bats' populations for food, and these bats are attacking them and transmitting Ebola to them. American citizens who are going over there, they are not just nursing these people back to health. They are providing them with food and making sure that they do not encroach on these bats without alerting them that these bats may be infected with Ebola. Also, once again, going back to Thomas Jefferson here, saying the first and only legitimate object of a good government, once again, only legitimate object of a good government is the care of human life and happiness, and not their destruction. What he's saying here is that human life is very valuable, and it is if one human life can be saved, that it is worth $1 billion. And that the United States can spend money on vaccines and raising awareness and the like in order to protect these people and to prevent this disease into evolving into a global pandemic, which, of course, would be very devastating to the economy and the health of people and everything else. Going back to contention 3 again, which, if you do not remember, said that medical personnel can take the proper precautions in order to not contract this disease. Of course, as my opponent pointed out, the nurses in Dallas who did contract this disease, they did take the proper precautions. They were aware of CDC guidelines of this, however they did contract the disease. I want to point out though that CDC guidelines were very strict on this, and they would be very easy to violate. So, for instance, could you take off a full body suit without touching it? That would be very difficult to do. And they had to have touched the suit in some way, and then touch their eyes, which are a very common way of catching the disease, not necessarily their mouth or their nose. And with saying that, I just want to point out that Ebola is very difficult to contract, and that the chances were slim that they would catch this disease. However, they did. I just want to say that the United States does have a moral obligation to help protect these people in West Africa. And now I would like to finish this debate and ask the viewers in the audience to decide the winner. Once again, my name is Colton Cooper.
And I'm Ella Cooper, and thanks for watching, guys.
This was our first debate.
And we hope you enjoyed it.
Yes. Once again, you are the public, and you do need to be informed. So look up stuff about Ebola, how you can avoid from contracting this disease, and what you can do to prevent it.
Be an informed public. That's the first step in order to save yourself and keep this disease from spreading to other nations and possibly infecting yourself.
Yes.
So
Thank
thanks
you
for watching.